Hello, everyone. I'm Courtney Cheetah with Wild Farm Alliance. Thanks for joining us today for the third roll of birds on Midwest Farms webinar. This is the third lesson of 10. This year, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary here at Wild Farm Alliance. And since the year 2000, we've been working with farmers to achieve healthy, viable agriculture that protects and restores wild nature. We have a 2050 vision in our three program areas. We aim to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms in our Farmland Flyways program, hedgerows of habitat the length to the moon and back, which is about 500,000 miles in our Farmland Wildways program, and 10% of river frontage on farms planted as farmland waterways, leading to 100,000 miles of ravine habitat. There is an array of publications and videos in our resource section of our website, including a publication on nesting structures for beneficial songbirds on Midwest farms and a beneficial bird native plant chart for the upper Midwest. Be sure to check those out as well. We are also wanted to highlight the Minwick Midwest gatherings that are happening coming up in the next couple weeks. Minwick, also known as the Minnesota Women in Conservation, is one of our partners here in the Midwest, and this is a really great opportunity to encourage and strengthen the network of women conservation professionals serving landowners, farmers, renters, and gardeners. And some of our staff will even be at the Red Wing event, and we'd love to meet you in person. Today's webinar is Birds in the Balance, Pest Control Types, and our speakers are David King from the University of Massachusetts and Megan Garfinkel from Chicago State University. Next month, will be our fourth lesson on integrating habitat into croplands, prairie strips, and bird conservation. And that'll be on December 2nd at 11 a.m. So we hope you will join us for that. We are offering a 1 credit of CCA credit from the American Society of Agronomy. To receive that credit, please have your license number handy and enter it into the evaluation form, which we'll be sharing at the end of today's webinar. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or if you're having any issues, let us know and we can try to help. Today, we're going to start our lesson with David. So I'll stop sharing and let him jump on and share screens.
Hey, thanks, Courtney. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's really great to have an opportunity to talk about this work that we did when I was with the Northern Research Station, U.S. Forest Northern Research Station based out of UMass. I was also adjunct with the University of Massachusetts, which gave me an opportunity to supervise a couple of really great graduate students, Isabel Brodsky and Sam Main, and to work with eminent entomologists Joe Elkington and Jeremy Anderson. And this work was actually supported by the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. Let's see, the program was, I'm retired. Yep, and it shows. Terrific. On we go. Birds on farms help farmers. So first part of this story has to do with birds on farms. And so I'm a research wildlife biologist, and one of the things that I'm concerned about is that there is sufficient habitat on the landscape for priority birds and to know which those priority birds are. And so if you look here on this graph, you can see forest and young forest. You can see that the vast majority of forest is mature and there's not a lot of this young forest shrubby habitat on the landscape. So we're really concerned about those communities, but also the species that inhabit them. Now, if you look at this upper right panel, that's a wildlife management area that's managed by the state with Pittman-Robertson funds. You can see it's got a mix of grass and shrubs, and those are really good for those species, those priority open area disturbance-dependent species that we're concerned about. But it came to our attention really that a lot of local farms, particularly these small diversified farms that are increasing in extent and number in New England, also have a lot of these habitats. Here's a farm near where I live in Amherst, Massachusetts. You can see it's got a nice hedgerow. It's got grasses and forbs, cropland, standing remnant trees. And so we were interested in knowing what kind of opportunities for conserving these priority birds are there on these farms. And so we got this funding from the NRCS and recruited Isabel Brodsky as a graduate student, and she went at it. She selected over 30 farms here in the Connecticut River Valley, sort of roughly shown in that little red box on the lower left-hand corner in map of Massachusetts. And Isabel went out to all these farms and she did these replicate point counts, standardized surveys to get an idea of what kind of birds were out there. She also measured the vegetation to see what kind of vegetation characteristics were associated with which bird species. And what she found is, hey, a lot of those priority birds species are out there. For instance, you got common yellow-throats, song sparrow, gray catbird, and indigo bunting. Those are all species that use sort of shrubby, grassy, herbaceous vegetation that on a landscape scale is relatively scarce. And so she found that those birds were present on the landscape, but she also found that they were positively related with tall, dense, woody vegetation. And so that was great for us. I mean, it was nice to know that they're there, but it's also nice to know that we can talk to farmers and we can say, if you want to improve the conservation value of your farm, conserve those shelter belt standing trees and habitat features like that. Conversely, Isabel found that pests were associated, like European starlings and house sparrows, were associated with open area. So that was nice because it means that when you're managing for those priority species, you don't end up getting these pest species. So great, those birds are on the farm, and we can tell farmers what they need to do in order to keep those priority birds on the farm. But what's in it for the farmers besides their making their awareness that they're supporting conservation? Most of the ones we talk to are, of course, conservation minded. But are there other sort of incentives based on the ecosystem services that these birds might provide to farmers? For instance, although a lot of these birds are carnivorous or eat fruit during other parts of the year, during the nesting season, they're really full on eating insects because that's what their nestlings use. They need protein, keratin, other things to grow. And so they're eating nonstop. And we had the benefit of a bunch of other great research that suggested that this might provide ecosystem services on other types of farms. What about these small diversified farms in the Northeast? What's in it for the farmer? So that's where Sam came in. That's Sam standing in the middle. I'll point out that's David Maria. We'll talk about his work in a bit. But Sam, he did a project to build on Isabel's results, assessing ecosystem services by birds using exclosures and genetic analysis. So what he did is he worked on 11 of these farms and he put these exclosures out there around crops. And what he did is he counted the insect pests, and he also gauged the damage to plants within those exclosures and outside of those exclosures. And the way this works is since birds can't get at plants within the exclosures, the difference between the plants that birds can't get to and the plants that birds forage on in terms of numbers of bugs and damage to crops, that's basically the amount that the birds are actually benefiting farmers. And you can see that they went out there, they put out these exclosures on 3 different kind of crops on 11 different farms. And they put them on brassicas, that's stuff like kale, cucurbits, that's stuff like squash, and solanaceae, I think that's eggplant. And they looked at the percent damage that's on the y-axis, and they found that for all of these crops, they're actually the exclosure, the damage is greater within the exclosure that on the plants that the birds couldn't get to. And this suggests that the birds indeed are driving down damage for all of these different plant groups. I think for these cucurbits might have been the only one that was statistically significant, however. Well, that's terrific. So which birds are really doing the work? We know which birds are on the farm. We know how to manage for different birds, which birds are doing. So we were interested in knowing which birds are really doing the work so we can manage specifically for these. And the way that Sam did that is he captured birds in mist nets on these farms. He collected the feces, extracted the DNA, and sequenced the DNA and matched those sequences up with a genetic reference collection that is available for all pest species. And with that, he was able to identify, for instance, the percentage of species, bird species A, that had pests in their feces. So what he found is that really gray catbirds and common yellowthroats are the top predators here, that they had like 17, 16, 17% of the samples, so the fecal samples that he collected and was able to sequence about had pest insects remains or genetic material in them. So that suggests that these birds are eating pests on these farms and are probably responsible for a lot of the control. I should notice the gray catbird eating a berry. So this for berry crops, all bets are off, and I think that's a different study. I'm sure. I'm aware that other people have done that work. So here we go. We got the top predators, and those are actually species that can be managed by appropriately managing the habitat. And so the farmers can actually manipulate the vegetation to increase pest control. All right, so I'd like to just finish up by talking about coffee. This is Doug Murillo's work. Coffee is, of course, is important because it's I think, the most lucrative, globally traded, legally globally traded commodity, and a bunch of us couldn't get out of bed without it. And so coffee, of course, is a shrub that grows in a lot of places, including Central America. We did this work in Honduras, and coffee is subject to damage by these coffee borer beetles. And you can see on those berries, there's little holes in there that the coffee borer beetle made. And there's a coffee berry that's been destroyed by borer beetles. So David Murillo, this is Martin Murillo, David's brother, set up exclosures around coffee plants and gauged the damage within inside and outside the exclosure. Again, getting an idea of how much birds are reducing the coffee borer beetle damage. And so they collected coffee borer beetle, coffee berries, brought them back to the lab, dissected them, and looked for damage, looked for larvae and eggs and adults, of course. And what they found is, again, here we've got a damage on the y-axis that's up and down, and then control versus enclosures. And you can see that there's about a 40% reduction in damage to coffee plants by coffee borer beetles attributable to birds. And so that's a big deal because coffee is a major crop. It's really valuable. And so what about the conservation implications of this? Well, it looks like what we thought that maybe surrounding forests could influence the abundance of birds. So David quantified the amount of forest surrounding these farms, and he found that, for instance, the damage rate was highest for farms with little forests in the cover in the landscape. And as forest cover increased, the amount of damage dropped, meaning suggesting that the birds were actually utilizing this forest for habitat, coming out in the coffee and eating coffee borer beetles. So this, of course, provides an incentive for people in Central America to, instead of planting coffee on all their land, to leave some of it forest. And so it's really great. I love these win-win solutions where taking care of nature also takes care of our farmers, increases yields. And with that, I'd just like to, again, thank UMass, the NRCS, for their support, the Wild Farms Alliance for the invitation, all of you for your attention, and then, of course, to our numerous partner farms that we worked with in the Pioneer Valley. Thanks an awful lot.
Thanks, David. That was awesome. We're going to launch a couple of poll questions. Thank you. Those should pop up for everyone there, and we'll give people just a minute to participate. David, do you want to go over those results?
Sure. Looks like people overall were of the view that these diversified farms are providing foraging and nesting habitat, which is really the most important way in which the songbirds that were the subject of this study were supported on these farms. Waste grain does support other birds, for instance, mourning doves and other really interesting birds that we're interested in, but not the ones that we're concerned with that are eating insect pests on farms. So maybe it was a little bit of a trick question. Yeah, um, we haven't really benefited from ecotourism, but it seems like it would be possible to generate something like that. You could imagine people going to a farm, going for a bird walk, and buying some produce. Anyone know of a program like that? That'd be fun.
Yeah, there's a farm that we've partnered with in Wisconsin that has like
Oh,
a bird
really?
lovers weekend.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, I'll try and spread the word. And then in Central America, in Honduras, we don't have a lot of, there's not really a lot of tourists there because the infrastructure is not really developed and there's a perception the place is dangerous, which isn't, really all that true. So really it is mostly just the services the birds provide in terms of coffee pests down there.
great. Thanks so much. Okay, next up is going to be Megan. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat.
All right, can you guys all see?
Yeah, it looks great.
Great. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Megan Garfinkel, and I am an assistant professor at Chicago State University. And I have been doing research on birds in different agricultural systems for over a decade now, looking specifically at pest control services like you were just hearing about. And so a lot of the information that I'm going to be telling you about is sort of a continuation of what David was talking about. So I'm going to be talking about similar methods that he was mentioning, but a different type of agroecosystem, specifically these large-scale corn and soybean farms that we often see in the Midwest. And with different surrounding habitats, so surrounding the farms. Some of the bird species are the same, some of them are a little bit different. So, as David mentioned, there is quite a bit of research in different types of agricultural systems showing that birds can have a significant pest control service. And when I'm talking about pest control in this talk, I'm going to be specifically talking about arthropod or insect pests being eaten by insectivorous birds. So a lot of the research came from coffee farms, the original research, as he was talking about. But we also have a lot of studies that have taken place in places like vineyards, apple orchards, things like that. And one sort of pattern that we see in a lot of these studies is that they take place in the types of farms where you're going to expect to find a lot of birds. So either sort of wildlife friendly farms, farms in tropical areas, farms that have trees to support birds. And so when I moved out to the Midwest, out to Illinois, I was interested in learning if birds were also going to be providing some of these similar pest control services in these intensive corn and soy fields that we see around here. So this map is now a couple years old, but not much has changed really. What we're looking at here is everything in yellow are cornfields, everything in green are soybean fields in the US. And then if we zoom in on Illinois, so I teach in Chicago, but I live out in this sort of corn and soybean world over here. You can see that the main land use type across the state is for these really intensive corn and bean fields. And of course, as I'm sure most of you know, these fields are rotated between corn and beans between different years. And so because of these really vast seas of monocultures, you don't generally think about there being a lot of bird biodiversity in these areas. And so if I wanted to find out if birds were actually providing some of these pest removal services in these corn and bean farms, what I wanted to do was start by thinking about where we would expect to find the most birds. And so, of course, in the Midwest, what the native or the main native ecosystem would have been before farming came in would have been prairies and grasslands. And these prairies and grasslands act as sources for bird populations. They have relatively high bird biodiversity, and so these birds potentially would be interacting with farms that are growing nearby the prairies and grasslands where they're breeding. And so the ways that they can interact with these farms, there are a couple of different methods that or interactions that we see. So we can think about birds providing services to farmers by eating pests. So here we've got the birds that might be on grasslands, but also move to the farms nearby. They can eat the pests of the crops, and that, of course, would be a service. They can provide disservices on farms in a couple of different ways. So first, they can potentially eat the crops directly, but there's a lot of research that shows that birds aren't really causing any major damage to these field crops. Field corn is mainly what I'm talking about, not sweet corn. And so I've got this in this dotted line here. We don't see that that's a major interaction, but one other disservice that they could provide is indirect. So they can eat the arthropod predators of those pests. And so if they're eating those predators, that could potentially be a disservice as well. And so I was interested in looking at some of these patterns of what birds were doing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a study I did over the course of a couple of years where I looked at farms that were growing corn or beans that were directly next to prairies or grasslands. Like you can see in this picture here, we've got the corn crops and then we've got the grassland here. And I wanted to answer two main questions. The first was, are birds providing these pest control services in corn or bean crops? And to look a little deeper to see what do those birds eat. So I'm not going to go over this too much because David already gave us a great introduction to exclosures, but just as a reminder, it's this experimental method that we can use to quantify the effect of bird presence. So any difference that we see in crop yield between exclosures and control plots should be due to the fact that birds are not able to reach those crops, but insects can because they've got this mesh netting keeping the birds out, but letting the insects come and go. And so I set up these exclosures in the soybeans and also in the cornfields. And in the first year of the study, I just compared the amount of crop yield between these two. So once you've harvested the crops, and you can compare the dry weight of the corn kernels and then also the actual soybeans themselves. So what I found in this first year of the study was that birds were having a significant positive effect in corn crops. So if we look at this, what we're seeing is where birds were not able to access, the crop yield was significantly lower. And this is actually something that you can put into economic terms. So if you were to value how much the presence of birds was giving you in that field, just in terms of how much more crop yield you get, I just did some back of the envelope calculations, found that it was potentially over $100 per acre in just grain yield that farmers were getting by having birds present. Although I do want to caution you, this is based on a really small sample size. And so these aren't numbers that necessarily I expect to be true on every farm, but instead what I'm hoping you'll get out of this is that birds potentially do have a really economically measurable service. So we actually found the opposite pattern in these soybean fields where birds were present, where birds were present in the control plots, we had significantly lower crop yield, which was an interesting finding. And so my first thought was that this might be related to that indirect disservice that I was talking about before. So birds eating beneficial insects. So I conducted the study in a second year, and this year I looked at not only the overall crop yield, but also the amount of damage by insect pests on the soybean leaves. So you can see some damage here. We've got these Japanese beetles. Here's the exclosure netting. And what we found in the second year was that, yes, there still was higher pest damage, meaning suggesting more pest activity where birds were able to access. But in the second year, there actually wasn't a resulting difference in the amount of crop yield. So in this second year, that's sort of a good news for if you're interested in conserving birds, because it's showing that in the second year, there wasn't actually that measurable disservice in terms of crop yield. And so to dig into this a little bit deeper, I wanted to know more about which arthropods are birds eating and which birds are eating pest species of arthropods in specific. And so for this, I did that DNA barcoding analysis that David had mentioned earlier. So basically the same slide that he showed, you collect the fecal sample, the birds are released after you collect the fecal sample, the birds are going to give you the fecal sample whether you want it or not, so the birds aren't harmed, and you end up with this prey species list. So again, in that first year of the study, I found that birds had been eating 6 different major pest species, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. But they also were eating quite a few natural enemies. So about 22% of the samples that I tested had predators or parasitoids in them, including a lot of different spiders and other things like green lacewings, stuff like that. So in that first year of the study, one of the most interesting pests that I found was that the northern corn rootworm was in the diet of about 35% of the samples that I collected. And the northern corn rootworm is a pest that can cause quite a bit of damage to corn crops. None of the pests that I found in that year were major pests of soybean crops. And so what I think was happening here was that we know that birds were eating these natural enemies. They were eating some of those pests of soybean crops, but probably the fact that they were eating those natural enemies outweighed any pest control that they were doing. So we see this overall negative effect of birds in the soybeans. On the other hand, in the corn crops, it seems like the fact that birds were eating this really economically damaging corn pest potentially means that that's the reason why we saw this overall positive effect of birds. And so we can also sort of look at which species of birds seem to be providing the most services. Some of these species that I looked at were the same ones that David had mentioned, but again, we're talking about slightly different types of agricultural systems. So I still had the song sparrow, the gray catbird, but also the dickcissel, some more of a prairie bird or grassland bird. And so if you look at the number of fecal samples that had DNA from the northern corn rootworm, you see that what was interesting for me was that the song sparrow, about 53% of the song sparrows that we tested had consumed this pest. So the song sparrow, I think, is a really cool bird. They're sort of drab and easy to look past, but it does seem like they're potentially a really great source of these services. They're also really widespread, which is cool because it means that potentially they could be providing great pest control services in a really wide variety of agroecosystems. So in the second year, I also did this DNA barcoding analysis. I sampled more birds, and in the second year, one of the most interesting pests that I had found that birds were consuming were Japanese beetles. So I know that they had been eating more of these longhorned weevils just by number of percentage. But when you think about the most economically damaging pests, if you think back to that picture that I had shown of the soybean leaves that had all of that Japanese beetle damage on them, it was interesting to me that the Japanese beetles had been found in about 18% of the fecal samples that I tested. So in the second year, birds were again providing a service, in this case with a different pest. And as I'm sure you all know, the density of pests differs by year. So some years might be worse years for Japanese beetles. And the year that I conducted this study, it was a pretty high density year for Japanese beetles. And if we think back to the song sparrow, again, I found that about 53% of the samples from song sparrows that I tested those birds had eaten Japanese beetles as well, which would suggest that, again, the song sparrow seems to be a great player on these farms in terms of providing some of those really valuable pest control services. So I believe I'm out of time, so I'm not sure if we've got time for some questions.
Yeah, if we have any questions, please put them in the chat. In the meantime, we can pop up the poll questions for you, Megan, and people can respond to those, and then maybe you can go over those. Yeah. It's so cool to hear that the song sparrows are the ones eating the Japanese beetles. That's a good question. I often get like, what bird is going to eat those Japanese beetles? Because how do we get rid of them? So that's super cool to hear about.
I was surprised about that as well, because even in my gardens, I see a ton of those Japanese beetles, and I'd like to know. I wanted to know who was eating them.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question, which of the following insects are crop pests that birds eat, at least in my study? The answer here is Japanese beetle. It looks like almost everyone got that. The green lacewing, they are actually predatory arthropods, so they are some of what we would consider maybe the beneficial arthropods, and birds are eating them, but they're not really crop pests. They would be natural enemies. And the second question, in which crop did birds provide significant pest control services? Split about 50-50 here. So the answer here is corn. I was studying what birds were doing in both corn and soybeans, but it looked like overall in corn it was a positive effect of birds, and then in soybeans it was either a negative or a neutral effect of birds being present, and that was probably due to that sort of indirect effect of birds eating some of those natural enemies as well as the pests themselves.
Great. Okay, so now we have time for questions. If anybody has any questions, I have a couple of questions. Megan, you showed that the one of the pests the second year was a weevil of some sort. Was that more of a pest of the soybeans than corn, or both?
So I believe, and I have to admit, it's been a little while since I've looked specifically at that pest species. I believe that one was more of sort of a generalist pest.
Okay,
Again, I would have to look that up.
great. And then I had a question for David about his study back with the vegetable farms. Wondering like what the most common pests that were eaten were, if you recall that data.
I don't. No, I don't remember. Yeah, I think I have I think I sent you links to those papers. There's three of them. Isabel came out with one on the Habitat Associations, and then Sam published one on the exposure results and one on the genetic results. And I can't remember what the species were. But it is neat to see the services that are provided by song sparrows. We're also doing, we're just completing a study on birds in solar arrays, and song sparrows come up as one of those species that is consistently abundant in these solar arrays. They're pretty widespread species, so it's nice to keep common birds common, but it's nice to think that those farmers in these expansive fields, and a lot of it is corn, are benefiting from, because right now we're getting to the point where we're writing the discussion, thinking about the discussion, and wondering about what are the value of these relatively common birds. We didn't find a lot of rare birds in them, but what's the value of these rare birds, and why should we be excited about them?
Yeah, the song sparrows have such a pretty song, so it's like there's the
Yeah.
benefit of having those on the farm as well, which is
Yeah.
really fun. Yeah.
Now, if anybody can come up with something good about house finches besides the fact that they're pretty, because house finches is really what nests in those arrays, because the railings underneath the panels, it's amazing how many birds you can get in one of those solar things. And we don't really know much about house sparrows in terms of whether or not, we don't see them much on farms, so I'm not sure if they have any benefit to farmers or detriment.
Interesting. Yeah, we've been digging into a lot of data with birds and insects and plant associations, and yeah. Looks like there are a couple questions here. How can changing climate and land use patterns influence the pest control services birds can provide? Either one of you want to take that?
Yes, when we have the spotted lanternflies creeping up the coast, so I guess who knows what that's gonna what that's gonna if there's any predators. You imagine it's huge and colorful and probably stinky. Megan, do you know anything about anything that eats spotted lanternflies or?
I'm not familiar with the most recent information, but I do think it seems like there's maybe an increase in the birds as they're sort of getting a little more familiar with them as a prey source, more birds eating them. I mean, I think in general, to answer that question, yeah, climate change is definitely going to affect potentially new exotic pests coming in, but also the fact that insects can respond really quickly to even slight changes in temperature, and so that might help them to reproduce more quickly. I think one of the most important services that birds provide on farms is just sort of this resilience to pest outbreaks. And so there is some research that shows that warming climate might lead to larger pest outbreaks. And those are things that we can definitely respond to, with pesticides, but that's not necessarily, we have to wait most of the time for them to get bad enough. And so birds are able to actually respond to those increasing outbreaks in real time, which I think is really cool. Like, for instance, the song sparrow, in the second year of the study, there were more Japanese beetles. And so we saw more Japanese beetles in the bird's diet. And so the fact that they're just there sort of responding in real time to changing pest densities, I think is a really cool thing that they can provide. And I do expect that with warming climates, we might see those outbreaks of different pests, either exotic ones like the lanternflies or just things that are there that are able to breed faster.
Nancy had a question about the neonicotinoid damage to the insects and the crops and thus the birds. Do either of you have any info on that? Treated seed that would then have a ripple effect?
Oh, Bridget Stutchbury did some work where she dosed white-throated sparrows, I think, with neonics and found that it affected their migration. They left later, maybe in poor condition, and didn't navigate as precisely.
Who did that study?
Bridget Stutchbury, she's at York University.
Great.
Yeah.
We can try to pull that up and put it in the resources for this webinar as well. Another question is, what are some of the gaps that still limit our understanding of birds as pest control allies?
So I think some of the gaps are just there's such a wide variety of types of agriculture with different types of habitat surrounding them. And so, we might expect to see different effects of birds in different types of agricultural systems. So what I found in these, large corn and bean farms isn't necessarily going to be the same results that you're going to see in other farms. And so I think part of bridging that gap is just going to be finding out what birds are doing in different types of agricultural systems. But I also think that there are, just like that, whoever had asked that question about the neonic damage, I do think we need to be more aware of some of the harms that the birds might be having, so getting from the farms. And so it's a win for us, it's a win for the birds, as long as we're not harming them without realizing by exposing them to pesticides. Or potentially, if we've got farms that are close to roads, potential collisions, things like that, or nests being damaged or destroyed by harvesting, depending on when that harvesting occurs in the year. So I think it's just something to be conscious of.
Great. And Megan, based on the results that showed birds were sometimes not effective for pest control in crops like soybeans, how can farmers balance attracting birds while minimizing risks?
Yeah, so I think that, first I want to say, emphasize that disservice that I found in the soybeans, that wasn't consistent from year to year. And I think that um, that's, it's just something to be aware of, that things are going to change over the different years. Um, I'm not sure what the answer there is. I think that there are certain species that we can try and encourage by supporting different types of habitat surrounding the farm. And Wild Farm Alliance has that great tool for that, for looking at that. And I think that we can, uh, I think also we need to think about a more holistic effect of birds. So my research has been to sort of point out some of the economic benefits, but I think that's just part of the larger picture as a whole. So there are benefits in terms of pest control, but there might be other benefits of having a more biodiverse farm as well. And so I think that's something to be aware of. I'm not sure if that's a great answer to that question, but that's what I got.
No, it's great. And there have been a couple links, David. Thanks for putting the link to that article in the chat. It looks like Vicky also put a couple different articles. The birds are the one line of defense against the spotted lanternflies, and then yeah, and then also in Cleveland's metro parks, dogs join the hunt for spotted lanternflies as well. So that's great. Great to see these symbiotic relationships with other birds and dogs to help us control pests. That's great. Any other questions out there? Please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm gonna throw this up here. Oh, one more question. For farmers who want to start small, what's one simple action that they can take to attract more pest-eating birds? Any thoughts?
Well, if you're in the Connecticut River Valley, uh, keeping if you have isolated trees, small trees around, and they're not interfering with your operations, so to retain those. And then if you have hedgerows, of course, those are also harboring some of these birds, according to Isabel's work. And then if you have areas on your farm that are fallow and that you don't have any plans for putting some, potentially cultivating some woody vegetation in those areas, would attract birds and increase numbers of song sparrows and great catbirds and other common yellowthroats that would help depredate those nasty bugs on your cabbages.
And I think it also depends on what type of farm you're talking about. So yeah, woody vegetation, or if you're in an area that would have, grasslands around, you can look into putting in some of those prairie strips that I think someone's going to be talking about in another seminar. But really, I think it comes down to habitat. So, the field of dreams idea, if you build it, they will come. I think that's sort of the first step.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, next month we'll be talking about prairie strips. So come back to learn more about those and how you can implement those on farms. I want to thank David and Megan for sharing your knowledge. Thanks for everyone for attending. The Role of Birds on Midwest Farms webinar series is part of a professional development grant from North Central Region of SARE. So thank you, SARE, for making this possible. We'd love your feedback. And if you need CE credits, we need your license numbers so that we can make sure you get that. We'll also be entering anyone who responds to the survey into a drawing to win a really sweet Wild Farm Alliance hat. So make sure you fill out the survey there. We'll get that in the chat. There are additional resources and research papers related to this webinar, which you can find on the research page for this webinar, and where we will also be posting the recording. So if you want to share that with friends and family, you can do that. And we hope to see you at our next webinar on December 2nd. Thank you so much for attending.